A shattered ornament. A silent witness to something sinister beneath the Christmas lights. Welcome to Marple Manor. I am your host, Hartwell. Tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Your comments always bring this mystery to life. Let's begin. The first snow of the season had the good manners to arrive as a dusting, no more, so that St. Mildred's Green looked prettily sugared rather than beleaguered. Children traced their initials on the iron railings. The brass band blew warm breath into their instruments, and Mrs. Honorine Lytton, chair of the parish council and most indefatigable woman in the county, marshalled the Christmas tree lighting with the crispness of a field marshal and the hat of a ship's figurehead. "Form a cue for Coco on the left," she trilled, fluting a hand like a concert conductor. "Keep the path clear for the tableau of shepherds. Percival, stop combing the sheep, there's a deer. And Reverend Pembroke, if you could hover by the plug, we shall do the countdown in precisely 3 minutes. Near the tea urn, a woman in a green tweed coat balanced 2 paper cups, a mince pie and a raffia bag decorated with holly leaves. This was Miss Beatrice March, B to a dwindling circle of contemporaries, and Miss March to anyone under 45. She had the mildest of faces, and the sort of calm attention that makes even the boisterous lower their voices. She had not come for the pageantry. She had come for the village, for its murmurs, for the small human arrangements one observes when everyone is a little cold and a little sentimental. "Fancy seeing you out in all this," said Dr. Lawrence Cole, the village GP, bustling up with a thermos as if it might be his stethoscope. He was round about the middle, sandy of hair and quick with opinions. "Oh, I don't mind the weather," said Miss March. "It's the hats I come for." She eyed Mrs. Lytton's contraption with polite interest. "So architectural." "Architectural and expensive," murmured Dr. Cole, whose wife had treated herself to a similar confection last year. He lowered his voice. "Keep an eye on Mr. Northcott, will you?" Treasurer looked strained. The accounts meeting was spirited. Miss March followed his glance. Harold Northcott, thin, grey-suited, an economy of a man, hovered by the bandstand with a clipboard clutched like a passport. He had the washed look of someone who had not slept, or had slept with a regret. Beside him was a younger woman with a leather satchel, neat gloves, and a nervous smile. Miss March recognized her as Mrs. Elena Vale, recently returned to the village after 10 years away, now secretary to the parish council. They spoke with their heads close, and Elena's hand did a small twisting motion with her gloves, as if she were wringing a damp cloth only she could see. 10. 9, cried the children, and the vicar, a gentle man of practical theology, aimed himself at the socket like a pilot approaching a notoriously short runway. The tree, a handsome Norway spruce, rose from a wooden crate at the center of the green, its lowest branches hung with tin stars, cinnamon bundles, and the village's peculiar pride. A set of hand-blown glass ornaments shaped like winter birds, each hollow and paper-thin, a legacy from some Victorian benefactor whose name no one remembered but whose generosity was cooed over annually. 3, 2, 1. Lights sprang out and climbed the tree. A cheer rose, the brass band blared, Good King Wenceslas and Snow, cooperatively theatrical, thickened just enough to catch the light. In that instant of communal delight, no one watched the tree's base. No one saw the boy in the red scarf duck under the rope to fetch the robin ornament he'd been eyeing. No one heard his mother's hissed, "Jamie!" And no one registered the small brittle sound the ornament made when it slipped from his mitten, kissed the edge of the crate, and broke. It was not a loud sound, but Miss March heard it. She always heard small endings, the snap of a patience, the shiver of a story closing. "Leave it, love," said a voice, Mrs. Vale's, half to the child, half to herself. But Jamie had already crouched, lifting the 2 curved halves of the crimson glass, so exquisitely thin it made its own silence, and staring at the tiny thing tucked inside, like a sweet in a cracker. He held it up with reverence and a little fear, a scrap of folded paper tied with red thread. "Back you come, Jamie," said Mrs. Lytton, bright even in rebuke. "We don't touch the decorations. Oh, what's that?" Jamie unfolded it with clumsy, mittened hands. A smear of resin from the thread darkened the corner. The paper was not new. The ink had bled along the fibers. 5 words sat primly on the strip, as if they had been waiting for precisely such an audience. "Forgive me. I was there." Someone laughed in the awkward way one laughs at a toy misfiring. Someone else said, "What a morbid little joke." The band blared obligingly off-tempo, as the conductor tried to signal another verse. Miss March, who had moved as naturally as if to warm her hands at the urn, peered not at the paper but at the faces, Mrs. Vale's eyes widening, not in curiosity but in recognition, Harold Northcote's mouth compressing into a white hyphen, young Peter Kersey, who ran the garage looking too intently at his boots. The vicar, good man, took the paper with the caution one reserves for relics and bad news. "It'll be from last year's mystery hunt," Mrs. Lytton announced, taking charge of the explanation. "We had clues around the green." "Put it down to that." "How whimsical." "Yes," said Miss March pleasantly. "How whimsical indeed." "Mulled wine," cried a volunteer at the urn, with the desperation of one who has noticed the air grow taut and hopes to soften it with cloves and sugar. Cups were pressed into hands, steam-clouded spectacles. Children swung sparklers in figure eights, and their parents said, "Not near the tree, darling?" For a minute the village succeeded in pretending nothing had happened. Then someone screamed. It was not the high theatrical scream of a child who has dropped a glove. It was a sharp adult note that slashed through brass and chatter. The scream came from behind the nativity scene, where the windows of the village hall formed a dark mirror. Dr. Cole was already moving, his thermos abandoned. Miss March followed without haste, but with an efficiency that parted people before her as if they were reeds. The tableau had the amateur charm of all village creations. A manger stuffed with hay borrowed from old Will's donkey, shepherds in scratchy blankets, the papier-mâché camel, whose expression suggested that sanctity confused him. Behind this was a narrow wedge of space between backdrops and the hall wall, a dead corner. As Miss March had once heard an organist call it, where sound went to die, Mr. Harold Northcote lay there, half sat, half slumped against the skirting, as if he had meant to sit down and had discovered, too late, that the ground was further than expected. His eyes were open. He was frowning at nothing. One hand was stretched towards the floor, as if to retrieve something. A star-shaped glitter was caught in his cuff. Dr. Cole went down on one knee with a grunt that was half exertion and half foreknowledge. He touched the man's throat. He set his jaw. He made a small, helpless motion as if to begin a procedure, and then thought better of it. "Call the police," he said, rising. His voice was flat with the knowledge of death. "And don't crowd, please. Give him air. Well, not that it matters now." Mrs. Lytton grabbed the back of a chair as if the village needed anchoring. "Oh, Harold," she said, and the hat seemed suddenly too large, a great bristling thing above a face gone small. "He was at my house at 2 o'clock going over the raffle takings. Perfectly himself." "He doesn't look hurt," said the vicar, hearing both the hope and the fear in his own words. He bent, then straightened, pulling his handkerchief from his sleeve in a gesture that belonged more to funerals than to first aid. Miss March did not press forward. She was not one for the scene or for unhelpful flapping. She stood a few feet away and watched the edges. Mrs. Vale, who had arrived behind them, and now held herself quite still as if movement might attract attention. Young Peter Kersey, again looking at his boots and then daringly at the urn. Mrs. Lytton trying to be seen being decisive. The boy Jamie, whose mitten had a smear of crimson glass dust that caught the light when he moved his hand. "Hart," someone murmured. "It may be," said Dr. Cole, but the reservation in his tone spoke of other possibilities. He glanced at the cup near the manger. A rim of mulled wine stained the lip. The steam had lost its confidence. "Don't touch that," he added too quickly. Several people stopped breathing for a moment, which is sometimes the only sensible response. "An accident," Mrs. Lytton said, with the fierce optimism of a person who has grown used to bending events to her will. "I will not have my event spoiled by misinterpretation." Miss March, who had known a good many events spoiled by far smaller things than misinterpretation, noticed a little trail of star-shaped glitter leading from the tree's lower branches to the gap behind the nativity. She noticed, too, the way the bunting safety pin on the left sagged more than the right, as if someone's sleeve had caught it. She noticed Mrs. Vale's gloves, neatly rolled, tightly held, the glove fingers pointing down like a bouquet. Chief Inspector Arkwright from the county force came at a near run, hat in hand, cheeks bitten red by the cold, his sergeant blowing behind like a puffing kettle. He had the squint of a man who imagined the world would arrange itself properly if only he could see the corners of it all at once. "Right," he said, as people's talk fell away in the presence of authority. "Nobody leaves the green. Names and addresses, please." "Doctor, what have we got?" "Her dead man," said Dr. Cole, who took out some of the sting by saying it gently. "Harold Northcott. No visible trauma." "I'd prefer not to speculate." "Speculation is my eel," said the inspector, then frowned as if the wrong proverb had turned up. "Her field." "My field." He looked at Miss March properly for the first time, registering her as one registers a lamppost. Present, reliable, irrelevant. "It would be practical," Miss March said, "to move the children back by the bandstand, and to cover Mr. Northcott if his family should arrive suddenly." Arkwright blinked, recalibrated, and nodded to his sergeant. "Blanket," he said. "Sir," said the sergeant, who had already fetched one from the boot of the police car and was walking carefully, as if not to disturb a thing whose name he didn't know yet. As the blanket laid its soft denial over the still figure, a pad of silence descended. The particular quiet that sometimes falls in a church when one is not praying but listening for something that may or may not be there. The brass band, after a murmur, put their instruments down. The children were shepherded, mildly indignant, towards the flapjacks. Snow kept to its business. The vicar, solicitous of souls even when they were no longer in residence, stood by the broken ornament which had been gathered onto a paper napkin like a fragile patient. He turned the little strip of paper over and then back again as if it might develop a second meaning if given time. "Forgive me. I was there," he read again, quieter, as if repetition might tame it. "Where?" asked the inspector, almost to himself. "Where were you?" "Sometimes people mean the thing, not the place," Miss March said, laying her empty cup on the trestle after one last sip. Not because she wanted it, but because the action of sipping gives one cover to think. The way one is there for a friend or there when something begins. Arkwright made a non-committal sound. "We'll need statements," he said. "All of you who were near that tree, and whoever put these baubles onto it." "That would be me," said Mrs. Lytton, with an expression that acknowledged happily that the evening returned. "After all, to her domain." "And me," said Elena Vale, her voice steady if you did not know how to listen. "I inventoried them with Mr. Northcott. We made a note about the robin," she added a beat later. "It had a hairline crack." "Noted," said Arkwright. Miss March saw the smallest thing then, not a clue exactly, but the kind of human tidbit in which clues are often wrapped. When Mrs. Vale said hairline crack, she glanced not at the ornament, but at the vicar, swift as a moth's flicker. He looked briefly stricken and did not know why, and so the evening settled into its unhappy shapes, the policemen making little islands of authority, the villagers forming little eddies of theory, the tree burning with a cheerfulness that now felt indecent. The band packed their instruments one by one. In the nativity, the papier-mâché camel beheld the blanket-shrouded figure and appeared, for the first time, appropriately grave. Miss B. March pulled her scarf closer, the better to hide the philosophical smile that did not suit the moment. It was not that she liked a mystery. She liked people, and mysteries were merely the way people showed you their patterns all at once. She watched the broken crimson glass, the thread stained with resin, the paper with its spare confession, and thought, quite without pleasure, that someone had chosen, The precise moment when the village felt most like itself to make. Sure, it never quite did again. The snow continued, its delicate drift over St. Mildred's Green, softening the outlines of the police cordon that now looped around the nativity scene. Lanterns flickered. The festive lights on the tree burned on, refusing the gravity of what had just occurred. People huddled in murmuring clusters, sharing theories already thick with imagination and fear. "Heart failure, surely," whispered Mrs. Petherbridge to her friend from the Women's Guild. "He was pale as milk at the last committee meeting." Her friend nodded, though her eyes followed the inspector's movements with avid fascination, hungry for a hint of scandal. Miss B. March remained near the tea-urn where the steam fogged her spectacles. She preferred to be thought vague at moments like these. It was easier to listen. Voices drifted like loose threads in the cold. The vicar murmuring to Dr. Cole about decency and next of kin, Mrs. Lytton fussing about the optics of tragedy during Advent, and young Peter Kersey muttering that the wine tasted off. Bea tilted her head slightly at that, though she did not turn. Observation, she often reflected, depended as much on stillness as on curiosity. Inspector Arkwright had gathered his small circle of authority, a notebook, a pencil stub, and Sergeant Hale, who seemed chiefly employed in apologizing to everyone he addressed. "We'll have the body removed to the hall for the doctor's full examination," Arkwright announced, brisk but weary. Then statements. "No one leaves the green till we're done." His glance caught Miss March's for a moment, uncertain whether to dismiss or acknowledge her. He settled for a nod. Bea inclined her head in return, as if agreeing to a private arrangement neither had spoken aloud. When the inspector turned away, she stepped quietly toward Dr. Cole. "A sad night," she said softly. He exhaled through his nose, fogging the air. "He was under strain, Bea. That account's ledger's been eating at him for weeks. Parish money misplaced. Nothing malicious, I'm sure, but Harold was the sort to feel every penny personally. Anxiety can weigh heavily," she murmured. "But anxiety seldom leaves glitter on the cuff." Dr. Cole frowned. "You saw that too?" "I saw many things," she said. "Perhaps none of them matter, but they form a pattern, don't they? Small glimmers if one looks long enough." Before he could reply, Sergeant Hale approached with a clipboard, his breath hitching in the cold. "Doctor, we'll need your statement." "Miss March, you witnessed the discovery?" "Only the sound of a scream in the aftermath," she replied gently. "But I'm quite ready to tell you what I noticed, Sergeant, though I'm afraid what I notice is seldom useful." Hale flushed. "Everything's useful, ma'am," he said dutifully, and hurried back to the inspector. Meanwhile, Elena Vale stood apart near the lamp-post, her face half-shadowed. She had not removed her gloves. Bea watched as the young woman's gaze roved to the tree again, then to the paper now sealed in a plastic sleeve. Her expression was not horror so much as calculation, someone fitting pieces together behind the curtain of her features. Bea crossed to her, unhurried. "A terrible business," she said. Elena started, then forced a smile. "Yes, horrible. Poor Mr. Northcott. He was so particular about everything." "Particular people often see more than they ought," Bea said mildly. "I remember he used to count every raffle ticket twice." Eleanor gave a small, brittle laugh. "That's Harold." "Was Harold?" She pressed her gloved hands together. "Do you think it was poison?" Bea regarded her gently. "I think we shall find out soon enough." The doctor seemed suspicious of the mulled wine. Elena's eyes darted toward the abandoned cup near the manger. "He didn't even drink much of it," she said quickly. "He disliked cloves." "How observant of you," Bea murmured. "You must have known him well." I worked closely with him, of course. Accounts, minutes, correspondence, of course." Bea smiled as if satisfied, but her gaze lingered a moment longer than politeness required. Then she turned back toward the bandstand, where a constable was attempting to calm Mrs. Lytton, who objected to the notion of cancelling tomorrow's charity raffle. "I refuse to let tragedy derail good works," Mrs. Lytton was saying, chin high, hat feathers quivering. "Harold would have wanted us to continue." "Possibly," Bea murmured to no one in particular, but I suspect Harold would have preferred not to die at all. The inspector had finished with Dr. Cole and was now crouched near the cup. He lifted it carefully by its rim, sniffed, then frowned. "Smells like ordinary wine to me. Poison's cleverness lies in not smelling extraordinary," Bea said quietly. Arkwright straightened, surprise flickering over his face. "You've opinions, Miss March." "Oh, only the ordinary sort. I've seen enough village mishaps to know that when something dreadful happens in a crowd, it's rarely the crowd's fault. It's someone's preparation. Someone always makes a little plan." The inspector grunted, uncertain whether to take that as wisdom or interference. He scribbled in his notebook. By the time the ambulance arrived, the snow had thickened to a curtain, softening every edge into gentleness again. Yet beneath the gentleness was the brittle pulse of unease, like a violin string too tightly wound. As the attendants lifted Harold Northcott's body onto the stretcher, a gust of wind stirred the tree. The remaining glass ornaments clinked faintly against one another, a fragile applause for the end of the evening. When the green had thinned of onlookers, Bea found herself walking beside the vicar toward the rectory. He carried the rescued fragment of the broken ornament in a napkin, unwilling to let it lie in police custody just yet. "It seems wrong," he said softly, "to have death in the middle of celebration." "Life seldom keeps tidy boundaries," Bea replied. "Joy and sorrow share a doorstep more often than we'd wish." She paused, glancing at the note again in his hand. "You seemed unsettled when the message was read aloud." He hesitated. "I thought only for a moment that I'd seen that handwriting before. But it was probably imagination." "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps memory is merely imagination that has waited its turn." They parted at the rectory gate. Bea continued alone to her cottage, her breath making small clouds that drifted away like thoughts she wasn't ready to keep. She lit a single lamp in the front window, out of habit rather than hope, and set her coat neatly on the peg. The fire still held some warmth from the afternoon. On her writing desk lay a small notebook, its cover cracked, its pages a map of observations, what people said, what they did not, and the subtle differences between the two. She sat, drew a line beneath the last entry and wrote in tidy script, "Christmas tree lighting, Harold Northcott dead." Paper in ornament, forgive me. I was there. Glitter on cuff, Mrs. Vale fear. Guilt, Dr. Cole notes anxiety. Mulled wine suspicious. She tapped the pencil once against the margin. Outside, the church bell tolled 8, each chime settling like a footstep into the silence that followed. "Forgive me," she whispered, repeating the phrase. A confession, but whose and for what? The fire sighed, and the snow pressed gently against the window panes. Somewhere in the distance, the faint wail of the departing ambulance dwindled into nothing, leaving only the soft hiss of falling snow and the measured rhythm of a mind quietly arranging its puzzle. The next morning arrived pale and crisp, sunlight glinting off the frosted hedges like fine sugar. St. Mildred's Green, so merry the night before, now wore a hush that did not belong to winter alone. A faint footprint trail crossed the square, leading from the church steps to the tree, where the police had strung a narrow cord around the base. The crimson shards of the broken ornament were gone, swept up for evidence, yet a small red shimmer remained caught in the snow like the last ember of a fire. Miss B. March opened her curtains precisely at 7. She never hurried her mornings. Thought she found came best with tea and stillness. The kettle steamed, the clock ticked softly, and the newspaper, brought by young Tommy Finch, who had already asked twice whether the murder would be in the London papers, lay folded on her kitchen table. The headline, inevitable as dawn, read, "Tragedy at Christmas tree lighting. Village treasurer dies suddenly." She read every line twice. No mention of poison yet. The article suggested heart failure, as most respectable papers did when uncertainty met polite society. But B noted the phrasing, "No signs of struggle." That, she mused, was often true of the most deliberate deaths. At 8:30, a knock came at her door, 2 firm raps and 1 hesitant. She smiled faintly, recognizing the rhythm of someone unused to morning calls. When she opened the door, Dr. Lawrence Cole stood there, bundled against the cold, a thermos tucked under his arm. His expression was the particular blend of briskness and unease that came from being the only doctor in a village full of gossip. "May I?" he asked, though he was already stepping inside. "Of course," Bea said. "The kettle's only just boiled." He removed his hat and rubbed his hands. "You'll have read the news, I suppose. Arkwright's calling it inconclusive until the coroner's report, but, well, I thought you should know." There was residue in the wine cup, trace amounts of digitalis. Bea's eyes lifted from her teacup. "Foxglove?" He nodded grimly. "Yes, common enough in gardens and easily ground to powder. The sort of thing one might hide in a spice tin. Or a clove jar," she murmured. He blinked. "Exactly what I thought. But the problem is, we can't yet say if Harold drank enough to be fatal. It's possible the dose was meant to frighten rather than kill, or that he'd had a weakened heart and it simply pushed him over." "Intent and accident make such uneasy companions," Bea said. "And what of the others?" "Did anyone else drink from that pot?" "Half the parish," he sighed. "We served it in bulk. Mrs. Vale ladled most of it out. But only Northcott seemed ill." He went down quickly. No one else complained of dizziness or sickness. Bea stirred her tea slowly. "So the poison may not have been in the pot at all, but in his own cup. Someone must have poured it for him." "Possibly," the doctor said, frowning, "though the inspector believes it was self-administered. That note, forgive me. I was there. He thinks Harold wrote it himself and hid it in the ornament as some sort of confession. Sentimental nonsense, if you ask me." "Sentiment and guilt are often neighbors," Bea replied, "but no man hides a confession in glass unless he expects someone to find it later. And Harold, I think, did not plan to die at the base of that tree." Dr. Cole gave her a curious look. "You sound as though you've already begun to investigate." "Oh, merely to wonder," she said, smiling faintly. "One wonders how a note sealed in an ornament last year, or perhaps years ago, could match the death of a man who touched it this year. Unless, of course, the past has longer arms than we think." The doctor shook his head, half admiring, half exasperated. "Arkwright could do with your kind of patience. He's already preparing to question everyone who had reason to quarrel with Harold, which, by all accounts, is most of the council." After he left, Bea wrapped her shawl more tightly and decided on a walk. The air was crisp, the kind that made breath visible but not unpleasant. She made her way toward the village green, where Sergeant Hale was taking down names from a cluster of shopkeepers who had appeared conveniently early to open up. He greeted her with mild embarrassment, as if aware she was collecting more from her stroll than he from his notebook. "Morning, Miss March," he said. "Inspector's at the hall, if you're curious. He's got Mrs. Vale in for another round of questions." Bea thanked him and continued on, passing the church where the vicar stood brushing snow from the steps. His expression was distracted. He carried the faint, haunted look of a man who had dreamed unpleasantly. "Good morning, Reverend," Bea said gently. "You look as if you've not slept." "I haven't," he admitted. "It's dreadful, Miss March. Harold was to meet me this morning about the parish accounts. I've been thinking, do you recall what you said last night about handwriting? I was right. I recognized it." "The note, it's Harold's," Bea paused. "You're certain?" "As certain as one can be. He wrote the weekly bulletins in that same narrow script, all precise little letters. I compared them. The F and the slant of the I identical." "Then he may have written it," Bea said softly, "but perhaps not for himself." The vicar frowned, not understanding. Bea offered him a kind smile. "Sometimes a man writes what another dictates, Reverend, or keeps a message he was meant only to deliver." Before he could ask more, the door of the hall opened and Mrs. Vale emerged, her face pale beneath her hat. Arkwright followed, expression guarded. He nodded curtly to Bea, as though recognizing her presence was unavoidable. "Routine questioning, Miss March," he said. Nothing alarming. Mrs. Vales confirmed that Mr. Northcott had been troubled by some irregularities in the parish accounts. Nothing criminal, mind you, just sloppy bookkeeping. Harold was never sloppy, Bea said quietly. The inspector sighed. That's what she said too, which means either he wasn't sloppy and she's lying, or he was and she's covering for him. Either way, there's something between them she's not saying. Bea inclined her head. There usually is. People are very fond of partial truths. They fit so comfortably in conversation. The inspector gave her a wary glance, then turned away. Mrs. Vale had stopped at the gate, fumbling with her gloves. Bea walked to her side, lowering her voice. "My dear, it's cold. Let me help you." The younger woman allowed it, though her hands trembled. "He didn't deserve it," she whispered suddenly. "Whatever people think, Harold wasn't wicked." "I never thought he was," Bea replied softly. "But guilt and goodness often keep company, don't they?" "Both believe in punishment." Elena's breath hitched. She met Bea's eyes for a heartbeat, eyes that saw too much, and then turned away, hurrying down the lane toward her cottage. Bea watched her go until the figure vanished into the pale shimmer of snow. By noon, the village had resumed its deceptive calm. Shop doors opened, the baker displayed mince pies, and Mrs. Lytton began rehearsing her statement for the local paper. But beneath it all lay an unease that no carol could soothe. Back in her sitting room, Bea added to her notebook, "Digitalis in wine, intentional." Note in Harold's hand, but meaning uncertain. Elena nervous, protective. Reverend uneasy, connection to writing. Glitter linked to Mrs. Vale's gloves. She set down her pen and gazed through the window at the green. The tree still stood, magnificent and indifferent, its lights flickering in the pale sun. Somewhere beneath its branches, in the memory of last night's laughter, the village's first secret had already begun to stir, and Bea March, with her quiet patience and her understanding of how people broke long before ornaments did, meant to follow it wherever it led. That afternoon the winter sun drooped early, casting long amber shadows over the green. The village hall, once filled with laughter and raffle chatter, now stood subdued under the solemn rhythm of official footsteps. The faint scent of mulled wine lingered, sweet, spiced, and faintly tainted by the memory of death. Miss Bea March walked with unhurried steps along the path, her gloved hand resting lightly on her cane, though she hardly needed it. She had spoken with no one since her conversation with the vicar that morning, choosing instead to let her mind settle into the quiet order of deduction. The mind, she believed, was much like embroidery. If one pulled too quickly at a knot, the thread would snap. Best to loosen it slowly, one small loop at a time. Inside the hall she found Inspector Arkwright standing by a trestle table covered with brown folders, his hat set aside and his hair ruffled by exasperation. He was not a cruel man, nor a stupid one, but his was the impatience of those who sought answers in neat lists rather than in people. "Good afternoon, Inspector," Bea said pleasantly. "I hope you don't mind an interruption." He looked up, weary but not unkind. "Miss March, I might have expected it. Drove a way of appearing when things grow complicated." "I find complication prefers company," she replied. "How fares your investigation?" He sighed, flipping through a file. "The coroner confirms what Dr. Cole suspected, digitalis poisoning. Enough to kill a man with a weak heart within minutes. But the question remains, how did it get into his drink? The pot was clean except for trace spice sediment. The ladle's been tested, nothing. The only contaminated source was his own cup." "Meaning the poison was added separately," Bea said softly. "Perhaps as he was handed the cup." "Exactly. But no one saw who poured it. We've statements from a dozen witnesses, all saying much the same, that Mrs. Vale and Mrs. Lytton served wine to the crowd, and Harold fetched his own cup not long before the lights were switched on." Bea nodded slowly. "And yet someone had time between the lighting and his collapse to slip something into that cup." "A busy few minutes indeed." Arkwright rubbed his chin. "Busy, yes. But I've questioned half the village and found nothing but gossip. Mrs. Vale swears she didn't pour his drink, though she admits she filled several cups. Mrs. Lytton is more concerned about the council's reputation than the death itself. And as for Kersey, the mechanic chap, he claims he was by the bandstand the whole time, but witnesses say he wandered near the tree just before the lights came on. Ah, B murmured. I remember Mr. Kersey's shoes, very clean for a man used to oil and dust. One might wonder what compelled such tidiness for a winter's evening event. Arkwright gave her a sidelong glance. You see more than's good for you, Miss March. She smiled mildly. Observation is seldom good for one, Inspector. It only invites worry. At that moment the hall door creaked open, and Elena Vale entered, her face pale against her dark green scarf. She started slightly upon seeing B, as though surprised the older woman were there. Oh, Miss March, Inspector. Her voice was polite, but the tremor beneath it betrayed unease. You wanted me to bring the account book, Inspector. I've found the pages Mr. Northcott wanted me to reconcile. She held out a small ledger, bound in brown leather, the corner of one page turned down where ink had bled faintly through. Arkwright took it with a grunt of thanks, motioning to B. You might as well sit. Mrs. Vale, no harm in a friendly witness. Elena hesitated, then lowered herself into a chair. The inspector began leafing through the book, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. These figures don't add up, he muttered. Look here, the charity account for last month. Withdrawals with no receipts. 4 entries in Harold's hand, but no signature from the treasurer. Eleanor clasped her gloved hands tightly in her lap. I told him something wasn't right. He said he'd explain after the festival. I think he'd discovered someone was taking money. And you didn't tell anyone else? She shook her head quickly. I wasn't sure who I could trust. Mr. Northcott was cautious. He said if anything happened to him, the truth would come out soon enough. B's eyes flicked to the woman's gloves again. Neat, cream-colored leather, clean save for a faint trace of glitter caught in one seam. Curious, B said lightly, how glitter finds its way everywhere after these festive events. I imagine you'll still be dusting it off come Easter. Elena glanced down, startled, then rubbed her thumb over the seam as if to erase it. Yes, it's impossible stuff. Arkwright looked up. Glitter? What of it? Oh, only that Mr. Northcott had a little of it on his cuff last night, B said. I noticed it when he fell. The same silver flecks used on the ornament decorations, I believe. A small detail, but perhaps the only one that might tell us who last stood close enough to brush against him. Eleanor's throat moved in a nervous swallow. You think whoever poisoned him was that close? I think death prefers proximity, B replied gently. It's a rather personal thing, poisoning someone. One must get near enough to offer a cup or to whisper regret. Arkwright frowned. Are you suggesting Mrs. Vale had reason to... B raised a hand, her tone calm. I suggest nothing yet, Inspector. Only that she and Mr. Northcott shared knowledge of irregular accounts, and perhaps one of them feared exposure more than the other. Elena rose abruptly. I've told you everything I know, she said, her voice breaking at the edges. If you're implying... Not implying, B interrupted kindly. Merely thinking aloud. You'll forgive me. Old habits. Elena gathered her scarf and hurried from the hall, the door closing sharply behind her. Silence lingered for a beat before Arkwright exhaled. You unsettle them, Miss March, every time. People unsettle themselves, she replied. I simply give them the opportunity. He smirked faintly, then looked back at the ledger. If Northcott uncovered theft, that could explain it. But why the message in the ornament? Who hides a note confessing guilt before dying? Someone who wished to appear repentant, B murmured. Or someone who wished another to appear so. The inspector stared at her, considering that while outside the snow began again, slow, deliberate flakes drifting over the village roofs. Miss March stood, smoothing her coat, and said quietly, When lies begin to melt, Inspector, they often leave a curious pattern behind. I think it's time I paid Mrs. Vale a little visit, before her truth hardens into something less pliable. As she stepped into the cold evening air, the church bell struck 4, its sound spreading through the village like a summons. The lights on the great spruce still twinkled, though one branch now hung bare where the broken ornament had been. Beneath it, the snow glistened faintly red in the fading light, a stain too delicate to wash away and too telling to ignore. Miss B. March walked with deliberate care down the narrow lane that led from the hall to the row of cottages near the old mill stream. The snow had deepened since morning, muffling the sound of her steps, and the smoke that rose from the chimneys looked oddly blue against the early dusk. Her breath made little clouds that vanished as quickly as her thoughts formed, yet each observation remained fixed and tidy in her mind. The trembling of Elena Vale's hands, the faint glitter on her gloves, the too hasty denial that had carried the sharpness of guilt rather than grief. As she passed the post office, she nodded to Mrs. Petherbridge, who was sweeping snow from her stoop. The woman leaned forward eagerly, voice lowered to the pitch of gossip disguised as sympathy. "Terrible business, Miss March. I always said poor Harold worked himself to death. Not that everyone's sorry he's gone, mind. Some folk didn't care for his way with figures." Bea smiled faintly. "Figures often have a way of revealing more than people intend, Mrs. Petherbridge. But one must be kind, even to the dead." She left the woman blinking and went on. Elena Vale's cottage stood at the end of the row, small but neat, with ivy climbing to the eaves. A single lamp glowed in the window, and through the glass Bea glimpsed movement, the quick pacing of someone who could not settle. She knocked lightly, and after a pause the door opened a cautious few inches. "Oh," said Elena, surprise and apprehension mingling in her tone. "Miss March, I hope I'm not intruding," Bea said, her voice kind but steady. "The inspector mentioned you were rather shaken. I thought a cup of tea and a little company might do good." Elena hesitated, then stepped back to let her in. "It's very kind of you. I'm afraid the place is a bit untidy." The interior was far from untidy. Everything bore the careful order of a woman who needed control. Books stacked squarely, curtains drawn to an even fall, a teapot already set on the hob. Yet beneath the neatness was tension, like the too straight line of handwriting meant to hide a tremor. Bea removed her gloves and accepted a seat by the small fire. "A charming home," she said softly. "You've been back in St. Mildred's only a short while, haven't you?" "Since October," Elena replied, setting 2 cups on the low table. "After my husband died, I needed to be somewhere quiet. I used to live here as a girl, and you found work with the council. That must have been a comfort, something familiar." Elena's smile was quick and brittle. "Yes, Harold was kind enough to take me on. He said he needed someone trustworthy. He was always very particular about that." Bea stirred her tea with slow precision. "He was a man who valued honesty above all else. Sometimes such people suffer greatly when they discover deceit close to them." The younger woman's hands froze on her cup. "You think someone deceived him?" "I think," Bea said gently, "that he discovered something which frightened him. The missing funds, perhaps, or the knowledge that someone he trusted had been less careful than he believed." Elena's throat moved as she swallowed. "You think that's why he died?" "I think it's possible he meant to reveal the truth," Bea replied. "But truth is a sharp thing, Mrs. Vale. Not everyone can bear the cut." There was a pause, filled only by the faint hiss of the fire. Then Elena said in a low voice, "Harold wasn't a bad man. He could be difficult, but he didn't deserve—" She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. "Didn't deserve to die?" Bea prompted quietly. Elena looked up, eyes bright with sudden tears. "Didn't deserve to be hated," she whispered. "People talked, said he was mean, secretive, but he was trying to protect the village. He found out someone had been taking from the accounts long before I arrived. He said he'd found proof." "Proof?" Bea repeated, watching her closely. "Yes, a receipt or something. He wouldn't show me, said he wanted to be sure before accusing anyone. But last week he was frightened. He told me someone had been in his house. that his papers had been disturbed. He thought it was an attempt to silence him. B nodded slowly. And did he name anyone? Elena shook her head, then added almost in a whisper, only that he couldn't trust the council anymore. He said even Mrs. Lytton might not be as innocent as she pretends. B's expression remained serene, though her mind quickened. Mrs. Lytton does like things tidy, she said softly. One imagines scandal would ruin her peace of mind entirely. Elena's fingers tightened around her cup. You don't think she... I think, B interrupted, that people often do foolish things to protect their reputations. But murder is rarely a tidy act. It leaves smudges where one least expects. The younger woman stared into the fire, her face pale. I shouldn't have told you this. If she finds out I spoke, I shan't breathe a word, B assured her, rising slowly. But take my advice, my dear. Lock your door tonight. And if anyone comes calling, even in friendship, think twice before opening. When B stepped back into the dusk, the snow had ceased, leaving a faint mist that curled around the lampposts. Her steps crunched softly as she crossed the green. The great Christmas tree still glowed, its lights burning with a cheer that now felt almost mocking. As she approached the gate of the vicarage, a figure detached itself from the shadows. Dr. Cole, his collar turned up, his face grave. I thought you'd be here, he said. Arkwright sent word. He's found something at Northcott's house. Said you'd want to see it. What sort of something? Bay asked. A letter. Unfinished. Dated the night before the lighting. He handed her a folded sheet inside a plastic sleeve. The ink was smudged at one edge, the words written in Harold's careful hand. If anything happens to me, the truth lies behind the red glass. She knows. B read it twice, the snowlight glinting on her spectacles. Behind the red glass, she murmured. The ornament that broke, the robin. And she knows. She looked up sharply, her mind aligning the final strokes of the puzzle like threads crossing on a loom. Dr. Cole, would you be kind enough to escort me to Mrs. Lytton's house at once? I believe the time for politeness is coming to an end. They started toward the Lytton residence, the lamplight flickering on their path. Somewhere far behind them, from the direction of the cottages, came the faint sound of a door slamming and hurried footsteps. On the frozen road, someone moving through the night with the desperation of a secret too long kept. Mrs. Lytton's house stood on the corner of the high street, a square brick structure with a polished brass knocker and windows that shone like small mirrors in the dusk. The curtains were drawn tight, and the light from within flickered. A fire, perhaps, or the nervous movement of a woman too restless to sit still. Miss B. March and Dr. Cole walked side by side up the path, their footsteps muffled by the thick snow that had begun to fall again. B. paused before knocking, her eyes traveling over the house with quiet attention. You notice, she said softly, how tidy her front garden remains even in winter. Not a hedge out of line. It tells you something, don't you think? Dr. Cole adjusted his scarf, giving her a puzzled look. That she's meticulous? That she dislikes surprise, B. murmured. Then she raised her gloved hand and rapped sharply on the door. It opened almost at once. Mrs. Lytton stood there, magnificent in a crimson dressing gown trimmed with fur. Her hair, set impeccably as always, glimmered silver beneath the lamp. But her eyes, those pale, commanding eyes, showed fatigue. They darted from B to the doctor, calculating swiftly. My dear Miss March, and Dr. Cole, what an unexpected pleasure, though I must say you both look rather serious for evening callers. Forgive us, B said, stepping delicately inside as if invited. We've come on a matter that cannot wait. It concerns the late Mr. Northcott. The colour rose and fell along Mrs. Lytton's cheekbones, but she gestured gracefully toward the sitting room. Very well. Though I warn you, I'm quite exhausted by this ghastly business. The inspector has already made me repeat myself 3 times. I cannot imagine what more there is to say. B seated herself in an armchair by the fire, folding her hands neatly. The warmth filled the room, carrying a faint scent of cloves. Too strong, Bee thought, as if something had been burned to disguise another odor. Mr. Northcott was a fastidious man, Bee began gently. He kept careful records and disliked disorder. I imagine you appreciated that quality in him. Mrs. Lytton gave a thin smile. Indeed, Harold could be tedious about figures, but he was reliable. We shared an understanding. He kept the council's books correct. And I kept the council itself from descending into chaos. And yet, Bee said, her tone soft as a lullaby, there appears to have been chaos all the same. Missing funds. Altered receipts. Mrs. Lytton's spine stiffened. Baseless gossip, she said crisply. Eleanor Vale was inexperienced. Mistakes were bound to happen. Bee's gaze did not waver. It's strange, though. Mr. Northcott told her he'd found proof of who was responsible. He intended to expose it after the festival. You see, Inspector Arkwright has just recovered a letter he began the night before his death. Dr. Cole, standing by the mantel, drew the folded sheet from his pocket and placed it on the table. The firelight trembled across the plastic sleeve. It says, "If anything happens to me, the truth lies behind the red glass. She knows." You were on the committee, Mrs. Lytton. You helped decorate that tree. For a heartbeat, silence expanded like a held breath. The only sound was the ticking of a clock somewhere behind them. Then Mrs. Lytton gave a short laugh, brittle and precise. Good heavens! Are you suggesting I hid a confession in a Christmas ornament? Really, Miss March, this is absurd. I'm suggesting someone used an ornament to hide something else entirely, Bee said evenly. Perhaps the proof Mr. Northcott meant to reveal. The red glass robin that shattered. It wasn't chosen by accident, was it? And the note inside was not written for confession, but for direction. Forgive me. I was there. The question, Mrs. Lytton, is where? Mrs. Lytton's hands gripped the armrest. You're indulging in melodrama. I hardly think, but Bee had risen, moving slowly to the mantel where a small wooden box sat carved with holly leaves. May I? She asked politely, and without waiting for consent she lifted the lid. Inside were fragments of ribbon, a pair of silver scissors and a tiny bottle labeled clove essence. She held it delicately between her fingers. A powerful scent, isn't it? Enough to mask something less pleasant, like foxglove, perhaps. The doctor inhaled sharply. Good Lord, Mrs. Lytton's voice snapped through the air. You've no right to accuse me. I've served this village faithfully for 20 years, and kept it under your thumb just as long, Bee said quietly. Mr. Northcott knew the accounts had been altered to cover your personal withdrawals. He confronted you, didn't he? Perhaps not in anger, but in that earnest, weary way of his. You told him to wait until after the lighting, that you'd make it right. And when he wouldn't delay, you planned something dreadful but efficient. Just enough poison in his drink to ensure he wouldn't speak again. Mrs. Lytton stood very still, her face drained of color. The crackle of the fire filled the silence. Then she whispered, You've no proof. Bee's eyes glinted, calm and unflinching. But Harold left it for us. The note in the ornament, forgive me. I was there. He wrote it weeks ago when he first uncovered the theft. He meant to place it with the accounts hidden inside the ornament, so the truth would be found if anything happened. He told Elena Vale, and she hid it as he asked. But you saw her, didn't you? You followed, replaced the ornament with another, one you'd prepared with your own note. You made sure when it broke it would speak guilt, not innocence. Mrs. Lytton's eyes flickered to the mantel, then to the window. That's nonsense. You can't know that. I can, Bee said softly, because the original ornament still exists. Helena hid it again after seeing Harold collapse, terrified you'd find it. She brought it to me not half an hour ago, Dr. Cole started. Bee, she did? Bee inclined her head. Indeed, the true ornament bears no confession, only the missing ledgers, folded small inside the glass. Enough to show precisely where the council funds went. She stepped closer, her voice lowering. You see, Mrs. Lytton, you were undone not by poison nor by greed, but by vanity. You believed no one would ever doubt your goodness. For a moment, The proud woman's composure trembled, the years of control slipping like a silk thread snapping under tension. "He wouldn't have kept quiet," she said finally, her voice shaking. "He said he'd tell the papers. Everything I built, everything respectable, gone. I only meant to frighten him, just enough to keep him still." Dr. Cole stepped forward, pity in his eyes. "And instead you killed him." Mrs. Lytton sank into the armchair, staring at her hands as if they no longer belonged to her. "It was only a little powder. I thought the clove would hide the taste." Bee turned to the doctor. "Fetch Inspector Arkwright, if you please." Then, as the door closed behind him, she looked once more at the defeated woman. "You might have asked forgiveness, Mrs. Lytton," she said softly. "But forgiveness, like truth, must be given before it's too late." The wind rose outside, sighing against the window panes, and in the silence that followed, the clock ticked on. Each second a quiet echo of the man whose sense of duty had cost him his life, and of the woman whose pride had cost her everything else. The room had fallen into a silence so complete that even the fire dared not crackle too loudly. Mrs. Lytton sat motionless, the weight of her own confession pressing down like the heaviest of winter blankets. Outside, the snow swirled faster, covering footprints, wiping away the visible evidence of those who had come and gone. It was as if the night itself wished to hide what had been said within these walls. Miss B. March remained by the mantel, her expression calm, eyes softened not by pity, but by an ancient understanding of human frailty. She had seen this pattern too many times, how pride sharpened into fear, and fear in its blind panic stumbled into ruin. Yet she knew better than to mistake confession for closure. A murderer's words did not end a story. They merely peeled back one layer of truth to reveal what lay beneath. The sound of boots crunching on the path outside broke the stillness. Moments later the door opened, and Inspector Arkwright entered, bringing with him a rush of cold air and the metallic scent of snow. Dr. Cole followed close behind. His face pale and solemn, Arkwright removed his hat, his eyes sweeping over the scene. The distraught woman, Bee, standing steady as a sentinel. "I came as quickly as I could," he said. "Dr. Cole told me what's been said. Is it true, Mrs. Lytton? You poisoned Northcott?" Mrs. Lytton did not raise her head. Her voice, when it came, was thin, brittle. "I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted to stop him. He threatened to destroy everything. The charity, the council, my reputation. You don't understand. This village depends on order." "It depends on me." The inspector's mouth set in a hard line. "Order doesn't come from deceit, madam." "You'll have to come with me." Bee moved forward slightly. "If I may, Inspector, perhaps a moment." "She's not dangerous now, only exhausted." Arkwright hesitated. Bee's manner had that rare quality of quiet command. Even authority paused before it. He gave a brief nod and stepped back toward the doorway. Bee crouched beside Mrs. Lytton, her voice low and even. "There is something I must ask before you go, my dear. You see, I cannot help but feel that Mr. Northcott's letter, the one that said 'she knows,' was not written about you at all. And if that's true, then we have another truth still waiting to be found." Mrs. Lytton's head snapped up, fear flashing in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I think," Bee said gently, "that Harold Northcott believed someone else already knew what you were doing, someone who helped you hide it once, and might have tried to protect you again. There's always a helper in such things, isn't there? The practical sort who mixes the drink, handles the ledger, arranges small conveniences. You were too careful to act alone." For a heartbeat, Mrs. Lytton said nothing. Then a tremor ran through her shoulders. "No," she whispered. "No, But the denial faltered. Her composure cracked, and in the flickering light Bee saw not defiance but dread. "He said he'd tell her," she murmured, barely audible. "He said she had to know before the police did. I thought he meant to frighten me, but he'd written to her." "To Elena Vale?" The name hung between them like a chill breath. Bee rose slowly. "Eleanor," she repeated, her tone reflective. "Yes, it would fit. She was loyal to Harold once, perhaps too loyal. When he uncovered your misuse of funds, She might have tried to shield you both, destroying receipts, adjusting figures, making it all seem tidy again. But then Harold decided to confess, and she feared that even her small part would be exposed. A woman like that would panic, especially if she'd once cared for him. Mrs. Litton's face had gone white as linen. She said she wanted to help. She said she'd take care of him, make him see reason. I thought she meant to talk to him, to calm him down. Bea turned toward Arkwright. Inspector, we must go to Mrs. Vale's cottage at once. Within minutes they were outside again, the wind cutting across the green, the great Christmas tree looming dark against the silver sky. Its lights flickered faintly, as if uncertain they dared shine. The path toward the cottages was narrow, and their boots broke through the crusted snow. When they reached Elena Vale's house, the windows were dark except for a faint glow from within, a single candle left burning. Arkwright knocked once, firmly, and then again louder. No answer came. Dr. Cole exchanged a glance with Bea, his breath clouding in the air. She was frightened when I saw her earlier, he said. You don't think? But Bea was already reaching for the latch. The door yielded with a slow creak. The cottage was still, the air heavy with the scent of extinguished wax. A cup sat on the table beside an open notebook, the ink still wet where the pen had rolled and left a careless streak. Beside it lay a folded letter, the name Harold written across it in trembling script. Bea crossed the room and touched the cup. It was warm. Her eyes moved to the fire, burned low but not cold, and the small tin of clove powder resting beside it. Oh, Elena, she whispered softly, for you meant to silence your own conscience. Dr. Cole moved swiftly to the back room, calling her name, but returned with a grim shake of his head. In the bedroom. Empty bottle of laudanum. She's gone. A silence settled, broken only by the wind scratching faintly at the shutters. Arkwright stood still, his hat in his hands, expression grim. She took the same way as he did then. Poison, good Lord. Bea folded her hands before her, her eyes distant. Guilt is an untidy business, Inspector. Guilt refuses to stay where we put it. Mrs. Vale carried more than one secret. She helped cover the theft, perhaps even tampered with the wine herself when she realized Harold might expose them both. But remorse is quicker than law. It leaves no time for confession. Arkwright nodded, heavy-voiced. We'll have to take statements, of course, and I'll send for the coroner. He turned toward the door, calling to the constable outside. Bea lingered, her gaze on the folded letter. She reached for it gently and read the first line aloud. Forgive me, Harold. I thought I could save you from yourself. She closed it carefully, setting it down again. Outside, the sound of carolers drifted faintly from the church square, their voices ghost-like through the falling snow. When at last they stepped back into the night, Bea looked toward the towering Christmas tree, its ornaments glimmering like distant stars. He said the truth lay behind the red glass, she murmured. And he was right, though not quite as he intended. Behind the glitter and good manners of this village lay the old familiar story. Pride, guilt, and love twisted by fear. Dr. Cole placed a hand on her arm. Do you think anyone will ever understand what really happened? Bea smiled faintly, her eyes following the drifting flakes. Perhaps, but understanding is seldom comforting, Doctor. Some truths are meant to be endured, not explained. The wind rose again, sweeping across the green, and the tree lights flickered once more, steadier now, as though the village itself exhaled. Bea drew her scarf tighter and began the slow walk home, her footprints vanishing behind her almost as soon as they were made, as if the snow, merciful and deliberate, wished to grant the dead their peace and the living their silence. The snow did not stop that night. It fell in slow, deliberate curtains, softening the shapes of the cottages, the church spire, the faint lamplight that trembled in the windows. By the time Miss B. March reached her own doorstep, the village seemed muffled under its white secrecy. She brushed the snow from her coat, hung it neatly on its peg, and lit the small lamp on her writing desk. Its glow revealed the calm order of her sitting room, the clock ticking faithfully, the teacup from earlier still on the tray, the faint scent of pine from a small branch she had gathered on her morning walk. She sat down, the quiet pressing close around her, and opened her notebook. For a long while she did not write. Her thoughts moved not to the dead but to the living, those left to carry the consequences of what fear and pride had done. The matter, she knew, would occupy the village for months. Yet in her mind, the story was not quite finished. Something about Eleanor's death sat uneasily in her memory, like a picture hung slightly askew. A knock at her door broke the stillness, light, uncertain. She rose, expecting the inspector, but when she opened it, the vicar stood there instead, his collar bright against the night. His face was drawn, and his eyes, kind though they were, carried the weariness of too much sorrow. "Forgive me, Miss March," he said softly. "I thought you might still be awake. The inspector asked me to call on Mrs. Vale's house to gather her papers for the coroner. I brought these." He held out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. Bea took it gently and gestured for him to come in. "Tea, Reverend? Or perhaps something stronger?" "Tea, if I may. It's been a long day." He sank into the chair nearest the fire as Bea poured water into the pot. For a time neither spoke, the kettle's low hum filling the silence. When the tea was ready, Bea untied the string and unfolded the brown paper. Inside lay Elena Vale's notebook, and tucked within its final pages a sealed envelope. The handwriting on it was uneven, the ink blotted by haste. It was addressed simply to Beatrice March. Bea looked at the vicar, whose brows lifted in surprise. "For me?" "So it seems," he said quietly. "She must have written it before she—" He did not finish the sentence. Bea turned the envelope in her hands, feeling the faint ridges of the pen strokes beneath her fingers. She broke the seal and read silently. The letter was short, the writing cramped and hurried. "You were right, Miss March. Harold trusted me with more than I deserved. When he found out about Honorine's thefts, he wanted to report her, but I begged him to wait. She had been kind to me once, and I thought I could fix it. I told her I would convince him to stay silent, that I would see the books corrected quietly. But she panicked. She said she couldn't afford another scandal, that people depended on her. I swear I didn't mean for him to die. When he fell, I tried to call out, but it was too late. I kept the truth because I thought it would save us both. You were always watching. I saw that in your eyes. Maybe that's why I'm writing now. Forgive me. I wanted to put things right, but I no longer know how." The last line trailed off in a smudge of ink. Bea folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. "So she meant to tell me," she murmured. Even at the end, the vicar looked at her over his cup. "She must have trusted you, perhaps. Or perhaps she knew that confession to me was a kind of mercy she couldn't find elsewhere." Bea sighed, gazing into the fire. "Guilt is a strange creature, Reverend. It drives us toward the truth even as we flee from it." He nodded gravely. "Arkwright will close the case now. Both guilty parties are gone. I suppose that's justice of a sort." "Justice," Bea repeated, her voice thoughtful. "Yes, perhaps. But not peace. That takes longer." After the vicar had gone, Bea sat alone for some time, her hands clasped around her teacup, her eyes distant. The wind rattled faintly at the window, and beyond it the snow continued its slow descent, hiding the scars of footsteps, softening even the memory of tragedy. She wondered whether the village would ever truly remember Harold Northcott as he was, a man of conscience, too honest for his own safety, or whether he would simply become another cautionary tale whispered at tea tables about pride and scandal. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the snow gleaming beneath a pale sun. Word had spread through St. Mildred's Green like smoke through a chimney. The murderer caught, another dead by her own hand, and the great Miss March once again at the center of it all. Children stared as she passed, and the butcher's wife offered her the choicest cut of ham with a conspiratorial whisper. Bea accepted their kindness with her usual composure, though her mind was elsewhere. She paused by the church where workmen were clearing the path for the evening's memorial service. The Christmas tree still stood proudly in the square, its ornaments dulled now under a fine glaze of frost. A constable was just removing the last strip of police tape when B approached. "Best to take it down soon," he said, tipping his cap. "Bad luck, some say, to leave it up after death." "Or perhaps good luck," B replied with a faint smile. "It reminds us that even grief must share space with light." When she turned toward home, she found Inspector Arkwright waiting near the gate. He looked less severe than usual, his shoulders relaxed, his hat under his arm. "Miss March," he said with a half-smile, "I suppose I ought to thank you. You've saved me another week of chasing shadows." "You'd have caught them eventually," she said, "but perhaps not before they'd vanished completely into the snow." He chuckled softly. "You make it sound poetic. Still, I can't help thinking we've left some things unsaid." B met his gaze steadily. "We always do, Inspector. Truth rarely fits neatly in a report. But you've done your duty, and that matters." He nodded, thoughtful. "Well then, Merry Christmas, Miss March. What's left of it?" When he was gone, B walked once more across the green. Children were building a snowman near the bandstand, their laughter carrying faintly on the air. She stopped by the bare patch where the broken ornament had fallen, brushing the snow away with her glove. Beneath it, she saw a single piece of crimson glass glinting like a drop of blood caught in sunlight. She picked it up and turned it over in her palm, the color rich and warm despite the cold. "It's curious," she murmured to herself, slipping it into her pocket, "how something fragile can hold a truth so strong." The church bells began to ring for evening service, their sound spreading over the village like forgiveness. B stood for a moment longer, watching the smoke curl from the chimneys and the light bloom in the windows. Then she turned toward home, her steps slow but sure, her heart quiet with understanding. For in the small snowbound village of St. Mildred's Green, where kindness and cruelty so often walked arm in arm, Miss B. March knew that peace, like truth, was something one had to find gently, one quiet observation at a time. The bells from St. Mildred's still lingered in the cold air as Miss B. March crossed the green once more, her coat buttoned tight against the dusk. Though the village had begun its slow return to normal life, shop windows glowing, laughter leaking faintly from behind drawn curtains, there remained in the stillness a tension, like a half-forgotten chord that refused to resolve. Death leaves an echo, she often thought, even when the dead are buried. As she approached her cottage, a familiar silhouette waited by her gate. Dr. Cole stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his hat dusted with snow and his face wearing that mix of worry and curiosity, particular to men who suspect the story is not yet finished. "B," he said as she neared, his voice low, "you'll forgive me for calling unannounced, but I couldn't quite rest after this morning. There's something I think you ought to see." She smiled faintly. "I suspected as much. You've the look of a man with a conscience or a clue, and both tend to keep one awake." He gave a short laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. "A bit of both, perhaps." "May I come in?" Moments later they were seated by her fire. The doctor withdrew a small parcel from his coat pocket and laid it carefully on the table. This was in Elena Vale's medical cabinet. The constable found it when preparing her things for the coroner. He brought it to me because he thought it looked odd. B unfolded the paper wrapping. Inside lay a small glass vial, nearly empty with traces of fine white powder clinging to its edges. A faded label bore a single word, Digitalis. B's eyes narrowed. "So she had the poison after all." "Yes," Dr. Cole said grimly. "And what's more, this label's one of mine. From the old dispensary stock. I haven't issued that in years." "Then it wasn't for Harold," B murmured. "It was for her." He looked at her sharply. "You think she meant to take her own life from the beginning?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps she kept it as a shadow of her guilt, a private punishment waiting for its moment. Some people find comfort knowing their end is within reach." Dr. Cole frowned. "There's something else. When I examined her before the inspector arrived, I noticed her left hand was stained. Faint but visible, glitter." B stilled. "Glitter?" He nodded. "Silver flecks. The same sort used on the ornaments." For a long moment Bee said nothing. The firelight flickered across her face, casting her expression into quiet focus. "She handled the ornament then," she said softly. "The one she claimed Harold had hidden the note in. But if Harold wrote that message for her, as I now believe, then she must have retrieved it, altered it, and replaced it before the festival began. Perhaps she hoped to bury her guilt beneath the sparkle of celebration." Dr. Cole's gaze was troubled. But why take the trouble to hide it all again? If she wished to cover her tracks, she could have destroyed it. Bee looked into the fire, her voice almost wistful. "Because, my dear doctor, remorse is rarely tidy. People who wish to forget the truth seldom destroy it completely. They only bury it where it might one day be found, as if hoping to be discovered. Harold meant that ornament to speak for him after death. She, poor woman, turned it into her confession instead." The doctor rubbed his hands together, uneasy. "It's finished now, though." "Two deaths," both explained. Bee shook her head gently. "Explained, perhaps, but not understood. And there's still one thing that doesn't rest easily with me. The note in Harold's own hand that said, 'She knows.' If he wrote that to warn me, why entrust it to someone who was already part of his undoing? Unless—" she trailed off, eyes sharpening. "Unless he didn't mean Elena at all." Dr. Cole frowned. "Then who?" "Someone who truly knew, not by confession but by observation. Someone who saw what others missed." Bee rose suddenly, her movements precise, deliberate. "Dr. Cole, I think I must trouble the vicar once more. If you'd be so kind as to fetch him, I believe the final piece of this puzzle lies within his keeping." Half an hour later, the vicar stood awkwardly in Bee's sitting room, his hands twisting his hat. "You sent for me, Miss March?" "Indeed," she said kindly. "You've borne a heavy burden, Reverend, and I'd not add to it without cause. But there's something you know, something you've tried in Christian charity to overlook. I must ask you to tell it plainly now." The vicar's face colored. "I don't quite—" "Please," Bee interrupted gently. "When we found the broken ornament, you recognized the handwriting on the note. You told me it was Harold's, yet you hesitated when I asked if you were certain. You said you thought you'd seen it before. Tell me truthfully, whose writing did it remind you of?" He hesitated, his mouth opening and closing once before words emerged. It looked like Elena's. Her hand was similar, small, slanted, but I told myself I was mistaken." "Not mistaken," Bee said softly. "Eleanor forged that note, just as she altered the ledger. She'd learned to imitate Harold's script while helping him with the accounts. That's why his letter to me, written hastily before his death, sounded so unlike his careful tone. He'd realized what she was doing and tried to warn me in the only way he could." The vicar's eyes widened. "Then she killed him after all." "Yes," Bee said quietly. "Though not from malice, I think. From desperation. She'd already hidden Mrs. Litton's theft, bound herself to the lie, and when Harold refused her pleas to keep silent, she panicked. Perhaps she meant only to sicken him, to delay his revelation. Instead, she killed him, and then when guilt became unbearable herself." Dr. Cole exhaled softly. "So the truth is divided between them. One woman's pride, another's fear." "Precisely." Bee sat again, her voice calm. "Evil is seldom born in one heart alone, Doctor. It grows where kindness turns cowardly, where good people tell themselves a small wrong will prevent a greater one. And so it spreads quietly, like frost on a window pane." Outside, the church bell struck 8. The vicar rose, his eyes glistening. "So you have a gift, Miss March. You see sin where others see only sorrow." Bee smiled faintly. "I prefer to see the humanity in both." When they had gone, she sat alone once more, the fire sinking to embers. She drew out the shard of crimson glass from her pocket and held it up to the fading light. Within its curved reflection, she saw the trembling dance of flame and thought of the people of St. Mildred's, so quick to judge, so quick to forgive, yet forever bound by their shared secrecy. She placed the glass carefully in a small dish on her mantel, beside a sprig of evergreen. Outside, the snow began again, slow and soft, as if erasing every trace of the night before. Bea watched it fall until the fire burned low, her expression serene but distant, the mind behind her eyes already turning, already tracing new patterns among the small mysteries of human hearts. The next morning broke clear but brittle, the sort of day when frost clung to every surface like lacework, spun by an invisible hand. St. Mildred's Green, wrapped in a deceptive calm, seemed almost to have forgotten the tragedies of the past week. Yet beneath that stillness, a current of unease lingered, whispered conversations, cautious glances, the lingering scent of fear that clings to places where truth has been disturbed. Miss B. March awoke earlier than usual. She had slept little, her thoughts circling like snowflakes caught in wind. The business with Mrs. Lytton and poor Eleanor might have ended to everyone's satisfaction, but B. had never trusted easy endings. They rarely existed outside fiction. She brewed her tea, sat by the fire, and reread the last page of her notebook, the quiet conclusion she'd written the night before, and frowned. Something still refused to fit neatly into place. At precisely 8:30, a knock came at her door. The sound was brisk but uncertain, like someone determined to appear composed while failing entirely. Bea rose, smoothing her cardigan, and opened the door to find Inspector Arkwright standing there, his hat clutched in his hands and a curious expression halfway between embarrassment and relief. "Good morning, Miss March," he said. "I realize I've troubled you enough lately, but, well, I thought you might want to see this before I put it in my report." "Come in, Inspector," Bea said warmly, ushering him to the fire. "The kettle's just boiled, and your tone tells me you've brought something that refuses to stay comfortably in its box." He managed a faint smile. "Quite right. It's this." From his coat pocket he drew a small envelope, the edges smudged with ash. "We found it behind the hearth in Elena Vale's cottage, hidden in the grate. The constable nearly missed it." Bea took the envelope, noting the faint scorch marks. Inside lay a folded sheet of paper, brittle from heat but legible. It bore Harold Northcote's handwriting, his precise, slanted script unmistakable now that she'd studied it enough. "To whoever finds this, if the accounts are in question, look not at the sums, but at the names." The theft began before Elena returned. She only followed orders she could not refuse. There is another who profits quietly, still hidden behind Charity's veil. Beneath it the signature H. Northcote. Bea read it twice, her pulse steady but alert. "So Harold did not suspect only Mrs. Lytton," she murmured. "He believed there was someone else still involved," Arkwright sighed. "That's what bothers me. We went through every ledger and receipt. Lytton's skimming is obvious enough, but there's no trace of anyone else. Unless he meant Vale herself, though that seems moot now." "Not moot," Bea said gently. "Misunderstood. Harold's note speaks of someone who profited quietly, not someone driven by fear. Mrs. Lytton stole to preserve her position. Eleanor concealed it to preserve her conscience. But there is another who benefited without either risk or guilt." Arkwright frowned. "You think someone else used them?" "I think," Bea said, rising to pour his tea, "that human greed seldom travels alone. It prefers company, if only to share the blame when discovered." She handed him the cup, her eyes thoughtful. "Tell me, Inspector, did you happen to check the Vicar's Church Fund? You recall Mrs. Lytton's insistence that parish donations had been redirected through her council account for expediency?" Arkwright looked up sharply. "You don't mean Pembroke? He's as mild as milk." "Indeed," Bea said softly, "and milk curdles quickest when left unattended." Within the hour they were at the rectory. The vicar greeted them with mild surprise, though Bea noticed the faint tremor in his hands as he gestured them inside. His study was warm and orderly, books arranged alphabetically, candles trimmed, and a faint scent of polish on the oak desk. "My dear Miss March, Inspector Arkwright, what brings you so early? If this is about the funeral arrangements—" "Not quite," Bea interrupted kindly. "We'll hear about the parish accounts. You see, Harold Northcote left a note suggesting that certain irregularities began before Mrs. Lytton's involvement. that they may have been facilitated, unwittingly or otherwise, by someone within the church. The vicar's smile wavered. That's absurd. Harold often grew suspicious. His mind wasn't what it once was. Perhaps, Bee said, moving slowly toward the desk, but suspicion is a weed that rarely grows without soil. May I? Without waiting, she opened the top drawer. Inside lay neat stacks of papers, receipts, donation lists, correspondence. One sheet, newer than the rest, caught her eye. She lifted it delicately. It was a bank slip dated 2 weeks before the festival. A withdrawal from the parish charity fund, signed not by the vicar, but by Mrs. Lytton, witnessed by a second signature, Reverend Thomas Pembroke. Arkwright leaned over her shoulder, his expression darkening. That's your name, sir. The vicar's composure fractured. How she said it was for the festival expenses. Decorations, music, the tree, good heavens. I didn't know she'd used it for herself. Bee turned, her gaze gentle but penetrating. Did you also not know, Reverend, that the same amount was quietly repaid last week from a personal check in your name? A check drawn on an account into which the council had recently deposited funds for roof repairs. He sank into his chair, colour draining from his face. She told me it was proper bookkeeping, that the council owed the church that much. I never questioned it. I only signed where she pointed. My word, Miss March, do you think me complicit? I think you were convenient, Bee said softly. Mrs. Lytton understood appearances. What better shield than a clergyman's name beside hers? It gave her scheme the scent of sanctity. Arkwright's jaw tightened, but Bee raised a hand. The law will decide the degree of blame. The truth, however, needed uncovering, and now it has been. The vicar buried his face in his hands. God forgive me, he murmured. Bee watched him for a long moment, her expression neither stern nor forgiving, only profoundly sad. Forgiveness begins with acknowledgement, she said quietly. The rest is a slower labour. Later, as she and the inspector walked back across the green, the sun shone weakly through thinning clouds, glinting on the snow. The Christmas tree still stood, though its lights had dimmed and its ornaments hung heavy with frost. So that's it, then, Arkwright said at last. 3 guilty, each in their own way. You've a knack for seeing sin where the rest of us see accident. Bee smiled faintly. Not sin, Inspector. Only weakness. It's a more familiar thing. She looked toward the church where the bell tower caught the light. People commit crimes for all manner of reasons, love, fear, pride, but it's weakness that binds them together in the end. And understanding that, I think, is the only way we ever make sense of them. Arkwright tipped his hat. You should have been a detective. I am, she said with a small smile, only of a quieter sort. They parted at her gate. Bee turned once more to glance at the square. The children's laughter, the faint sound of the bell, the shimmer of red glass still resting where she'd left it on her mantel. In its surface the firelight trembled like memory itself, fragile, luminous, and eternal. She closed her door softly behind her, the quiet of her cottage enfolding her once again, while outside the village of St. Mildred's settled slowly back into its peaceful, watchful calm. Evening settled over St. Mildred's Green with a gentleness that felt almost deliberate, as though the village itself were weary of turmoil. The snow had melted into glistening rivulets along the cobblestones, and a faint mist curled over the rooftops. In the quiet that followed the scandal, life began tentatively to resume its shape. The bakery reopened, the brass band rehearsed for the postponed carol service, and children, undeterred by tragedy, resumed their games near the frozen pond. Yet a solemn awareness lingered, the unspoken knowledge that beneath every smiling facade, truth had left its mark. Miss B. March sat by her hearth, the last of the season's holly wilting in its vase. Before her lay her open notebook, its pages filled with neat lines of script that chronicled not only the puzzle but the people behind it, their motives, fears, and little vanities. She read it one last time, pencil poised before closing the cover with finality. A tidy conclusion, she murmured. though her tone held no triumph. But tidy conclusions are rarely tidy hearts. A knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, Inspector Arkwright stood there looking uncharacteristically at ease without his hat. The scent of tobacco drifted faintly about him. "Evening, Miss March," he said. "Thought I'd stop by before the train. I've finished the report. Your name's in it, of course. I did my best to make you sound modest," Bee smiled. "A lost cause, I fear. The village will embellish my role before the ink dries." He chuckled, stepping inside as she poured him a cup of tea. "It's strange, though. Cases like this, one expects grand conspiracies, but in the end it's all just human weakness, as you said. Pride, fear, a bit of greed. Nothing extraordinary." "Exactly so," Bee replied, settling opposite him. "The extraordinary thing is how ordinary it always seems. A theft for pride, a death for fear, a lie for love. Each small reasonable step until one looks back and finds oneself in tragedy." She stirred her tea slowly. Mrs. Litton's vanity, Elena's guilt, the vicar's silence, they all thought themselves doing something necessary, even right. That is what fascinates me. People seldom set out to be wicked. They simply forget to be good. Arkwright regarded her thoughtfully. "You ever tire of it? Seeing the cracks?" She smiled faintly. "Never. Cracks let the light through, Inspector. And understanding them helps one forgive a little faster." They talked a while longer, the formalities of the case, the village's recovery, the upcoming memorial for Harold Northcott. When at last Arkwright rose to leave, he paused by the mantel, where the fragment of red glass still gleamed beside the evergreen sprig. "You kept it," he said. "A reminder," Bee answered softly. "It once held something broken and something true all at once. Much like the people who made it," he nodded. "You know, Miss March, if you ever tire of village mysteries, there's a place for you in the county force." She laughed lightly. "Oh, I've enough crime here to keep me occupied. St. Mildred's is far more instructive than any police file. Human nature seldom travels far. It just changes its hat." When he had gone, Bee sat for a long time listening to the wind pressing softly against the window. Outside, the church bells began to chime, their sound rolling gently through the mist, warm and resonant. She thought of Harold Northcott, his meticulousness, his loneliness, and of how easily honesty can become a danger when others are afraid of it. She thought of Elena Vale, who had meant only to protect, and of Mrs. Litton, who had built a life too fine to risk crumbling. Rising, Bee crossed to the window. The green lay hushed beneath the faint light of the street lamps. A few villagers passed, their laughter faint but real, the sound of ordinary life reclaiming its place. For the first time in days, the air felt lighter. She whispered to herself, "All's mended as much as things ever are." Then, with deliberate care, she lifted the crimson shard from the mantel and slipped it into a small wooden box, the same that held her magnifying glass, her notes, and a pressed rose from a case years past. She closed the lid, smiling softly. "Another lesson kept," she said, and turned down the lamp. Outside, the bells finished their song, the echoes fading into the distance until only the whisper of snow remained. St. Mildred's Green slept again under its quiet sky, its secrets folded away, its people restored to their small kindnesses. And in the little cottage by the lane, Miss B. March sat peacefully beside her dying fire, her mind already sifting through the gentle, inexhaustible mysteries of human nature.